The battle that should have been impossible, yet they won. Imagine a scenario where logic, probability, and historical precedent all predict failure, yet victory emerges. History is dotted with these paradoxical moments, instances where the improbable became reality, and in studying them, we uncover insights not only about warfare, but about human cognition, social dynamics, and the very architecture of resilience. Today, we explore one such battle, a case study in how perception, adaptation, and the collective human psyche can defy deterministic logic. It is a story that challenges our assumptions about limitation, strategy, and the capacity for human systems to respond under extreme stress. To understand this, we must frame it in both historical and scientific terms, examining how societies behave under pressure, how neurons mirror societal networks, and how adaptive mechanisms can transform apparent weakness into strength. When a military force is vastly outnumbered, poorly equipped, or facing a seemingly insurmountable tactical disadvantage, the first instinct is to assume collapse. This assumption is mirrored in our cognitive heuristics. The brain seeks patterns and probabilities, often anchoring on the most likely outcome. Psychologists term this the availability heuristic, where recent or vivid examples dominate our assessment. In historical context, this heuristic has led countless observers to dismiss the potential of underdogs, yet history repeatedly demonstrates that emergent strategies, rapid adaptation, and collective synchronization can override statistical expectation. In the battle we are about to explore, the forces that should have been crushed instead leveraged what cognitive scientists today might describe as network intelligence. Just as neurons in the brain can reroute signals when pathways are blocked, human societies, under extreme stress, often develop alternative channels of coordination, communication, and innovation. The parallels are striking. In the brain, plasticity allows for unexpected pathways to transmit information, preserving function despite injury. In a military context, leaders who understand and exploit social and psychological networks can produce outcomes that seem impossible from an external perspective. This battle did not happen in a vacuum. The forces involved were ordinary people with ordinary fears and ambitions, yet they were subjected to extraordinary circumstances. The terrain, the logistics, and the numerical disadvantage all pointed towards certain defeat. Yet defeat was avoided, not through sheer luck, but through a deep, emergent synchronization between individual cognition and collective behavior. Soldiers, often considered mere instruments of strategy, in this case became dynamic agents in a complex adaptive system. Every choice, hesitation, and improvisation was amplified through the network of interactions, creating emergent patterns that confounded a more rigid, conventional opponent. What we see here is an example of what historians sometimes call the ghost of initiative, a phenomenon where adaptive, decentralized action produces results that rigid command structures cannot predict or counter. From a psychological perspective, this taps into the concept of flow, a state of heightened awareness and efficiency, where stress and challenge combine to produce peak performance. Flow is not just an individual state, but can emerge collectively when groups are aligned around clear goals and adaptive feedback loops. In this battle, the conditions were extreme enough to trigger collective flow. Fatigue, threat, and necessity coalesced to sharpen perception, decision-making, and coordination. The terrain itself became a psychological factor. Every obstacle, every perceived disadvantage acted as a signal to the adaptive system. Modern neuroscience suggests that the brain constantly constructs models of the environment to predict outcomes. When those models are stressed, or when the predicted outcome is failure, new pathways can emerge. Similarly, the army in question faced environmental and tactical stressors that forced creativity, improvisation, and the reorganization of conventional assumptions. Traditional military doctrine might have condemned such improvisation, but in this case, adaptive flexibility proved superior to rigid hierarchy. The result challenges conventional notions of force and probability. It also offers a profound philosophical lesson. Limitation can catalyze ingenuity. Constraints, often seen as a barrier, function as selective pressures that push systems toward novel solutions. Evolutionary biology teaches us that stressors, rather than merely threatening survival, can drive adaptation. This battle is a case study in that principle. Leaders who understood not only the terrain but the psychology of their troops and the cognitive tendencies of their Opponents were able to shape outcomes by influencing perception and decision-making. They exploited biases both in themselves and in the enemy, turning expectation against reality. There is an often overlooked neurological metaphor in this. Neurons fire not in isolation but in concerted, probabilistic patterns. Similarly, soldiers operate not as discrete units but as components of a larger network. When communication, trust, and shared mental models are optimized, the network exhibits properties that no single unit possesses alone. Emergent strategy, then, is the natural consequence of a well-connected, adaptive human network under stress. In the heat of battle, fear and uncertainty can amplify dysfunction or, paradoxically, catalyze cohesion. This duality reflects the neurobiological principle of excitation and inhibition. Just as excessive excitation in neural circuits produces noise and dysfunction, uncontrolled fear can fragment a unit. Conversely, controlled stress, when combined with trust and adaptive protocols, can heighten responsiveness, creativity, and coordination. Historical accounts of the battle describe moments where small, decentralized decisions produced disproportionate effects. A single detachment holding a seemingly insignificant position redirected the opponent's attention, disrupted supply lines, and triggered cascading effects that altered the entire battlefield. This is reminiscent of the concept of sensitive dependence on initial conditions, popularly known as the butterfly effect in complex systems theory. But there is also a philosophical layer here. Human beings, when confronted with imminent threat, are forced to confront their own perception of possibility. The soldiers in this engagement were aware of the improbability of their situation. Yet, instead of succumbing to despair, they embraced agency. They acted within the constraints of their environment, not as passive recipients of fate, but as active participants in a probabilistic system. In that sense, this battle illustrates a fundamental principle. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the intelligent navigation of uncertainty. The enemy, by contrast, fell victim to cognitive rigidity. When individuals or organizations operate under the illusion of control, they often underestimate adaptive opponents. Military history is full of examples where numerical superiority failed because the larger force assumed that linear strategies would guarantee victory. Here, the superior force relied on conventional models, overestimating predictability and underestimating emergent adaptation. They did not anticipate the complex feedback loops from decentralized action, spontaneous reconfiguration of defenses, and creative exploitation of environmental signals. From a social psychology perspective, this highlights the power of shared belief systems and collective cognition. Groups with flexible mental models and a shared sense of purpose can perform feats exceeding individual capabilities. Conversely, groups constrained by rigid doctrines or overconfidence often fail to capitalize on emergent opportunities. Implications extend beyond military history. Understanding how networks respond to stress, perception shapes action, and decentralized adaptation outperforms rigid hierarchy. The battlefield becomes a laboratory for human cognition, a stage where resilience, emergence, and adaptive intelligence are enacted in real time. Yet, there is a paradoxical twist, a subtle insight bridging historical and philosophical dimensions. The same weaknesses that appear threatening, exhaustion, vulnerability, scarcity, also function as protective signals. They force focus, trigger innovation, and catalyze collective problem-solving. What seems like fragility often contains the seeds of resilience. The battle demonstrates that limitations are not merely obstacles but can be reframed as sources of emergent strength. In practical terms, the army leveraged every apparent weakness. Terrain disadvantage became tactical obscurity. Resource scarcity became a driver for improvisation. Numerical inferiority amplified the impact of each individual action. This reframing is mirrored in cognitive therapy techniques, where perceived limitations are reframed as opportunities for growth and adaptive learning. The convergence of history, psychology, and neuroscience here is remarkable. The battlefield exemplifies principles observed in neural networks, adaptive systems, and human behavior under stress. It challenges linear, deterministic interpretations of events and underscores the probabilistic, emergent nature of reality. In understanding this, we gain insight not only into a singular battle, but into the architecture of human resilience. The story compels us to ask deeper questions. How do ordinary individuals, under extreme pressure, collectively transcend expectation? What mechanisms transform fear into coordinated action? How does emergent strategy arise spontaneously from decentralized decision-making? And ultimately, what does this tell us about the limits of prediction in any complex system? These are questions not confined to history, but relevant to contemporary challenges in leadership, crisis management, and social coordination. They reveal that human systems, like neural networks, possess latent capacities that emerge only under the right combination of stress, necessity, and collective cognition. Reflecting on this battle also forces a reevaluation of how we define strength. Superiority is not solely a function of numbers or resources. It is a function of adaptability, perception, and the capacity to act coherently within constraints. In this sense, history is not a ledger of winners and losers, but a study of how systems biological, social, and cognitive respond to complex pressures. The lessons extend into philosophy as well. The battle invites contemplation on the nature of possibility, the fluid boundary between weakness and resilience, and the dynamic interplay between individual agency and collective structure. It illustrates that the improbable is not inherently impossible. Rather, impossibility is often a reflection of incomplete understanding, constrained perspective, and linear thinking. As we conclude, the victory that should have been impossible serves as both a historical marvel and a lens for understanding broader principles of human behavior. It teaches us that emergent phenomena, adaptive intelligence, and the constructive harnessing of constraints can produce outcomes that defy expectation. It reminds us that the architecture of human systems, neural, social, and organizational, is inherently capable of exceeding apparent limits. When conditions trigger collective alignment and adaptive creativity, and perhaps most importantly, it invites us to reconsider our assumptions about limitation, probability, and agency. The battle is over, but the questions it raises endure. How can we cultivate adaptive capacity in our own organizations, our communities, and ourselves? How can we reframe challenges not as barriers but as signals for innovation? And how can we recognize that what appears as weakness or impossibility may, under the right conditions, be the very catalyst for extraordinary achievement? History, neuroscience, and psychology converge in this singular event to offer answers that are both practical and profound, revealing that the impossible is often only a temporary construct, awaiting the emergence of intelligence, adaptation, and collective coherence. In contemplating this, we are invited not merely to admire a historical outcome, but to internalize its principles, to recognize the latent capacities within ourselves and our networks, and to approach challenge with curiosity, resilience, and strategic creativity. The battle, therefore, is more than a historical incident. It is a mirror reflecting the dynamics of human potential. It encourages us to ask, in our own lives, when faced with the improbable or the seemingly insurmountable, how can we mobilize collective intelligence, adaptive strategy, and emergent action to produce outcomes beyond expectation? The answer, as history demonstrates, lies in understanding that networks, whether neural, social, or organizational, possess emergent capacities that manifest most vividly under pressure. Limitations are not purely obstacles, they are signals. Scarcity, threat, and constraint catalyze the very processes that make the improbable possible. And just as neurons reroute to preserve function, human systems under stress can reconfigure, innovate, and prevail. As you reflect on this, consider your own environments, your teams, your communities, your personal networks. Where are the hidden pathways, the untapped capacities, the emergent signals waiting to be harnessed? The past offers not only a record of events, but a blueprint for understanding how intelligent adaptation, coordinated cognition, and collective alignment can overcome what appears impossible. The victory that defied expectation is thus a timeless lesson in resilience, strategy, and human potential. If this exploration of history, exploration of history, psychology, and emergent human intelligence has inspired new ways of seeing the past and understanding the present, I encourage you to continue the conversation. Share your thoughts in the comments. Engage with others on how these principles manifest in contemporary challenges, and join our community in exploring the pathways where history, cognition, and philosophy intersect. Subscribe to Past Lens for more deep dives into the moments where human systems transcend expectation, where the improbable becomes possible, and where understanding the past illuminates the potential of our shared future.